In 1974, a 3M scientist named Art Fry was frustrated. He used small paper bookmarks to mark his place in a hymnal, and the bookmarks kept falling out. He remembered a colleague, Spencer Silver, who had, 4 years earlier, accidentally created an adhesive that was sticky enough to attach to surfaces, but not so sticky that it left residue when removed. Silver had been trying to create a strong adhesive and had instead created a weak one. Nobody at 3M had found a use for it. Fry combined Silver's adhesive with his bookmark problem and proposed what would become the Post-it note. 3M's commercial development team reviewed the proposal and did not see a market opportunity. Paper already existed. Tape already existed. The specific gap that Fry was describing, you need something that sticks but that you can remove without damage, was not recognized as a problem that enough people had, in a severe enough form, to justify commercial development. The proposal was passed over. Fry kept making samples and distributing them to colleagues at 3M. The colleagues used them up, and came back for more. The behavior of the early users, the way they integrated the sticky notes into their work without being asked to, provided the market evidence that the commercial review had not found. In 1980, the Post-it note launched nationally. It became one of the best-selling office products in history. The idea that became the category standard had been rejected by the organization that owned the technology required to build it. The rejection was not irrational. The market evidence that would have justified the investment was not yet present when the review was conducted. The evidence was created by giving the product to users, which only happened because the inventor was persistent enough to do it on his own. Twitter's 140-character limit originated as a technical limitation. SMS limits were 160 characters, and the original Twitter design reserved 20 characters for the username, leaving 140 for the message. Jack Dorsey proposed the microblogging platform constrained by SMS technology's 160-character limit. This severe limitation forced users to distill thoughts to their essence, creating a new communication culture built on brevity. The constraint wasn't a bug, it was the feature that differentiated Twitter from every other social platform. Twitter was not rejected internally in the same way the Post-it was rejected at 3M, but it was rejected by the environment it was proposed in. Odeo, the podcasting startup that Dorsey and others were working for in 2006, was facing potential extinction after Apple announced iTunes would support podcasts. Dorsey's idea for a microblogging platform was proposed as one possible pivot for the company. The pitch did not generate immediate enthusiasm from Odeo's investors, who had funded a podcasting company and were not obviously in a position to evaluate a microblogging platform. The company went through a restructuring in which Ev Williams and others bought the company back from its investors, partly because the investors were uncertain about the new direction, and the Twitter product continued development under the restructured entity. The idea that became one of the most influential communication platforms of the 21st century was proposed in a context where nobody was certain it was the right direction. The uncertainty was reasonable. A 140-character microblogging platform was not an obviously compelling product in 2006. The constraint that would become its defining characteristic was, initially, just a technical limitation. Have you ever watched an idea get rejected in its original context and succeed when it found the right context for what it actually was? Leave a comment. The Post-it and Twitter share a structural feature that applies to a significant portion of rejected ideas that later became category standards. The rejection was correct, given the information available at the time of the rejection, and the success was possible only after additional evidence had been generated that wasn't available when the rejection was made. This is the specific mechanism behind the rejected idea that became the standard. Not that the rejectors were wrong, but that the idea required validation that the initial proposal couldn't provide, and that the persistence of the proposer generated the validation that changed the evaluation. Airbnb was rejected by 7 prominent investors before it received its first institutional funding. The rejections reflected a coherent concern. People would not rent out their homes to strangers, and strangers would not pay to stay in other people's homes when hotels existed. The concern was logical. It was also answerable by evidence, by the behavior of the first users who did rent their homes to strangers, and the first guests who paid to stay in them. The evidence that answered the rejection was generated by the founders, not by the investors who had the resources to generate it. Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia, facing the rejection, continued to host guests themselves, gather feedback, and iterate on the model. The evidence they generated, real users, real transactions, real outcomes, changed the evaluation. Combinator's Paul Graham described his decision to fund Airbnb despite his initial skepticism as being based on the founders rather than the idea. He didn't think the idea would work. He thought the founders were the kind of people who would find a way to make it work, or to find the thing that actually would. He was funding the judgment that the evidence they'd gathered was real, not the idea itself. If the specific structure, rejected idea, persistent evidence generation, evaluation change, is what makes this channel worth your time, the like is the direct signal. The employees who built the first iterations of Post-it notes, Twitter, and Airbnb were not building category-defining products. They were solving immediate problems: sticky bookmarks, internal team communication at a failing startup, rent money during a design conference, with the tools and resources available to them. The path from immediate problem to category standard is, in each of these cases, a path of accumulated evidence. The colleague who used the Post-it and came back for more, the early Twitter user who found the 140-character constraint clarifying rather than limiting, the first Airbnb guest who told other people about their experience. None of this evidence was available at the time of the initial rejection. All of it was generated by the people who believed in the idea enough to keep making it available, at small scale, to the people who would use it. The design conference where Chesky and Gebbia first rented out airbeds in their apartment, the one that prompted the idea for Airbnb, was not a market research exercise. They needed money for rent. The business came from the problem, and the evidence came from the business, and the evidence changed the evaluation. The practical lesson from rejected ideas that became category standards is about the relationship between the quality of an idea and the quality of the evidence available to evaluate it. Most ideas that are genuinely good fail their initial evaluations, not because the evaluation was wrong, but because the evaluation was conducted without the evidence that would make the idea's quality visible. The Post-it failed its initial review because there was no evidence that users would find the specific product compelling. The Post-it passed its subsequent evaluation because Art Fry had generated that evidence by distributing samples. The practical thing, when an idea fails an initial evaluation, the most useful question is not, was the evaluation wrong? It is, what evidence would have to exist for this evaluation to reach a different conclusion, and is that evidence generatable without the full commercial investment the initial evaluation would have required? If the answer is yes, if the specific evidence that would change the evaluation is generatable at small scale, with limited resources, by the people who believe in the idea, then the rejection is not a conclusion. It is a specification. Here is what you need to demonstrate before the evaluation changes. Most rejections are specifications in this sense. Most proposers receive them as conclusions. The people who generated the evidence and returned with it are the ones who eventually changed the evaluation. The next episode looks at a case where the constraint was not a market limitation, but an organizational one, and where the constraint, rather than limiting what was possible, defined what became possible. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.